To everybody watching, my name is John Black. I'm going to be the presenter and facilitator for this panel. It's an exploration of sense-making, decision-making, specifically how management can overlap in policing, and the value of management research as well as researchers in law enforcement, a place that a lot of people may not consider that there's overlap, and yet I would argue that there is. So what we're going to do for housekeeping points is please use the chat under Zoom or Huba, whatever you're doing. I'll ask that, I'll try to make sure and keep up with it. If we have time in between the breaks of the panel, what we'll do is maybe ask one or two questions there as a pause, and then we'll try to get to the rest of the questions by the end of it. The slide deck is already up on Huba. You can take a look at it. If we adjust on the slides, I will give you an updated deck on Huba as well. So we are very, very lucky here. The four people you see in front of you, the four people on your cameras, have well over a century and a half of experience in law enforcement. All of them hold either doctoral degrees or practical doctoral degrees in education, anything ranging from jurisprudence to business to you name it. They've studied on it, and I'll allow each of them to give their own brief introduction. One of the reasons why we're here is to simply engage and just keep a conversation going and to start a conversation. So what we're going to do as a way of keeping this conversation going and starting it is each of the speakers are going to speak to the three framing questions of the conversation. So from their perspective, a challenge that they see that they're facing in policing today, how the challenge is potentially intertwined and affected by things like perspectives, authority, influence, power, things that are outside of your controls, things that management research and management theory deals with every single day. Part of the stuff that we were just speaking with, the last one I attended before Riza's was dealing with, Bob was telling about technology and technology adoption at the medical level and all these different things. You guys know this stuff, but we don't see enough of you potentially that could bring your insights into the policing area where we're in a huge state of flux right now. So what research or new perspective or understanding or insight do these panel members have that they wish that you might be able to help them on? Reference with these three questions. So I always go back to this. We got here with a certain type of thinking, and we're probably not going to be able to get out there with the same kind of thinking. So what is the thinking, just to frame it for law enforcement? Law enforcement, we tend to be pretty linear when it comes to problem solving. And what we do is we do the typical things. We identify the problem, we gather information, we analyze, we develop courses of action. This is not a bad way to do something. It works really, really well in what a Cynefin framework would describe as a complicated system. It doesn't work really well in complex systems. And the problem is we're dealing with complexity right now. You've heard some of the topics of this conference dealing with things like uncertainty for the last keynote speaker with Saris, and these idea of how we deal with these type of things of complexity, uncertainty. However, there is a lot of really good work being done with how to deal with complexity and best practices. That comes out of the business world. Take a Cynefin framework, really good at helping to foster reframing. This is not a model, it's a framework. And notice it's actually got 5 dimensions with disorder being in the middle. And the reality is the relationship between cause and effect can only be perceived in hindsight. That's one of the hallmarks of a complex. It becomes obvious after it's been solved. Oh yeah, we should have done that. We should have done this. Law enforcement has tried anything from CompStat to all these other different types of things. And yet we look at it afterwards and we say, how come we didn't know that? Well, you didn't know that because you're in a complex system and it's only known after it gets done. It's one of the natures. There's best practices in complexity. Rather than if you take a look over here in the complicated area of the ideas of good practice, this is what we usually do in linear. We sense, we basically go out, gather a bunch of information. We then apply experts against it. How has it worked before? What do we do about this? and then we respond or we act. Doesn't work real well with complexity. In fact, in complexity, one of the recommended practices under a Cynefin framework would be to do a bunch of safe to fail type experiments where you're probing to figure out what you know and what you don't know. And you're focusing first on sense making. And then and only then do you have iterative and dynamic responding. You're focusing more on the reality that you're learning what the next problem will be and how do you deal with that. Well, isn't that what we're dealing with, things like de-escalation, dealing with the mentally ill, loss of citizen trust? How do you train and plan for use of force in law enforcement? Isn't that some of the same exact problems that management deals with? Not the de-escalation, obviously, but all, for example, and we have de-escalation instructors as part of the speakers. The skills of de-escalation, you could take the same exact books you use for negotiation, organizational theory, and anything else in management, and they will be almost synonymous. Why won't they be? It's people working with people. It's not a reductionist theory. It's an and versus an or type thinking. We can move in these areas between the different frameworks. There's a lot of research being done on it, and it even has things like areas that aren't quite one or the other, referred to as liminal states or states of transition. Well, we could look to this. This is a possibility. What about, we've heard already discussed today, technology adoption. Well, we've got used models, whether you believe with Davis or TAM 1, 2, and 3, or technology operational environment. But do you really think that the community or the agency or the line officer has the same perspective or attitude towards using it, or its intention, or it's that? How does each perspective change or view the system model differently? Why don't we have experts in management that deal with this all the time, these different models, working with helping us in law enforcement understand the pitfalls and different problems with technology adoption? So again, what I want to do here is I want to just start the conversation that there is obvious overlap, at least in my premise. So that being said, I'm going to click through the stuff for Chief Wallentine. So Chief, if you would introduce yourself, and then we'll go on.
I'm a little bit surprised, having dealt with me, John, that you didn't say, Chief, would you unmute yourself? That's my first.
that would be my lead in.
That's my first. That's my first test of the day, and I think I passed. So I'm Ken Wallentine. I'm happy to be here today, and have known these other three folks for a number of years, and honored to present with them. I'm the Chief of Police in West Jordan, Utah. It's the third largest city in Utah, where right now we are in the middle of a great drought. So I see some of you from around the country that are getting plenty of get lots of rain, lots of moisture sent it our way. So I want to start off by talking about one of, I think, the most difficult challenges in the human resources area for law enforcement today. And that's the notion of how do I get good cops into my organization and keep those good cops. You know, the cost for me to hire a good cop at the very front end is relatively minor. The cost for me to hire a bad cop at the front end is relatively minor. But the cost for me to hire a bad cop on the back end is just tremendous. It's just it's significantly great. So if you go ahead and click to the next slide for me, John, that's got the dollar amounts on it.
Did you want to go through these bullets, Chief?
I mean, you're telling me I passed I failed my second test. I was going to actually go through those as I move forward, but we can talk here for just a minute. One of the challenges that I faced, and John did introduce the fact that I'm an attorney, but I have my own legal staff, and it's always interesting. They say that the person who is their own client has a fool for a client, or their own attorney has a fool for a client. How do I deal with my agency lawyer when, for example, as recently happened, I'm going to give you an example that I hadn't discussed with my co-presenters. I recently fired an officer for public use of the N-word. And if you don't know what I mean by that word, I'm not going to tell you, because it's a word so offensive to me, and and so repulsive that we don't use it in our organization. In fact, he used the word as he was about to use force on two people of color in my community. The use of the force was absolutely appropriate. The use of the word was not. Not surprisingly, he, like me, is a member of the union, and very quickly engaged a union attorney to defend him in his termination action. And we went through weeks and weeks and months of litigation over that. At the same time, I had the human resources people weighing in, wondering whether I had acted rationally, and wanting to talk to me about whether I understood the ancillary costs and all of the collateral consequences of terminating him as opposed to some other discipline. I spoke about this officer to a community group. I spent an hour and a half in a meeting called First Step to More Trust with some people in my community last week. They were people primarily of color. And it's an opportunity for people in my community to come and speak to the chief of police in just about any fashion they want. And when I gave them this example of an officer using that word, and I didn't at first tell them that the context was using the word in a use of force incident, the reaction from the group was powerful, and it was fast. And I think every one of them, in fact, a couple of them actually did. They put their hands together and they clapped for the fact that I had terminated this officer's employment. Well, there's got to be middle ground. There's got to be some middle ground between satisfying the needs of providing equitable policing in the community, dealing with my union and the union lawyers who their job is to zealously represent the client and make sure that the officer gets a fair shake, and sometimes make sure the officer gets a little bit better than a fair shake. And my human resources people are saying to me, Chief, do you have any idea what it's going to cost us if we have to litigate this? Do you have any idea what it's going to cost us to replace that officer? And they're pretty deaf to my response. Do you have any idea what that's going to cost me in legitimacy in my community if I don't? All right, with that, John, I'm going to ask you to go to my dollar slide because I was about to throw down a number. My budget analyst, who's very good, tells me that it cost my department $51,562, $51,500 essentially, to hire and train an officer to entry-level competency. That is, from the moment they come in our door, they go through the police academy and they complete a field training program. So we trust them on that first night shift out there all by themselves, sort of. But if I can steal an officer from another agency, I can cut that cost by as much as half. And I can cut the lag time. I can cut the time between hiring that person and putting that person out on the street all by herself or himself that first night at about half the cost. But as I look at who I'm hiring, many times, and I use quality background investigators. It's their only job. All they do is do background investigators. Many times when I hire one of those lemons, I get lemonades, and lemons always have lawyers. And my lawyer always ends up dealing with their lawyers. Firing officers who no longer perform to standards or engage in misconduct is often complicated by the labor organization, the union representatives. In fact, many police unions in this country were formed, or they grew in response for calls to police reform in the 1960s. I find that to be incredibly ironic. Now, I've been a cop for about 40 years. We've been cops in my family for 150 years, 151 actually. And my two oldest kids have each got 10, 12 years in policing. And by the time we're all done, and I've got a grandson headed that way, we'll have 200 years in policing in this country. The French say the more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, in the 1960s, we were dealing with some of these same issues, and we have yet to engage with any better thinking. So I go back to John's initial quote about doing the same thing over and over again and trying to find new ways of thinking. One of the challenges that I have is that the incumbent officers, because of the systems we have in place, they may be able to cleanse their records of serious misconduct by a cyclical purging of disciplinary files, because that's a requirement that's in our collective bargaining agreement with the union. I think one of the most poignant examples of this challenge today is the head of the Minneapolis Police Union, who spoke out against police reform advocates shortly after the death of George Floyd, and he trashed the local political leaders, accused them of selling out his members, and firing the 4 officers who were quickly fired without due process, including the one who's on trial right now. And the union president referred to the protesters and the reform advocates as a terrorist movement. He previously spoken out about the President Obama being an oppressor of the police, and perhaps ironically, that union leader has, I believe it's about 29 complaints on his own table. Thanks. Next one, I want to talk about a fellow by the name of Sean Sullivan. So Sean Sullivan, in 2004 in a small Oregon town up in your neck of the woods, John, was caught kissing a 10-year-old girl on the mouth, and he was sentenced as a sex offender. And part of his sentence said that you could never be a police officer anywhere else. It was part of his sentence, but 3 months later, August 2005, he gets hired not just as a police officer, but as a police chief at another force in Cedarvale, Kansas, where he was again investigated for an inappropriate sexual relationship with a young girl, and eventually convicted on criminal charges, felony charges, and he's now serving time in prison. Who really wants this kind of cop out there on the street? I really don't know. None of us, I really think. Even the union folks, guys like this is not someone they really want out there. But he's an example of what I call the gypsy cop. Someone who leaves my organization, and it may be your town that they go to, or frankly, because of the weak systems in my own state, it may be my own state that they next turn up in. So how can you help me? Well, I'm sure that in your professions represented here today, some of you, and if you go ahead and advance the slide for me, John, thank you. Some of you must have similar gypsies. Now, I don't know if there are gypsy business professors. I don't know if there's gypsy management professors. I suspect that they are. Perhaps the cost, if you'll allow me to posit this, perhaps the cost of hiring a bad cop, a gypsy cop, is much greater than the cost of hiring just about any other kind of service provider in our community, say perhaps a direct provider of medical services. Do we really understand as the public the cost of putting the wrong cop in the wrong job with the power and the tools to deprive a person of liberty, even deprive that person of life? So where do I find as a police chief the common ground with my agency's legal counsel, who really doesn't want to have to litigate, and my human resources manager, who really doesn't want to have to go out and fill that seat, as well as the union leaders, in achieving the outcome of quality cops providing effective, constitutionally guided policing? I don't think that the answer can be consistent with Shakespeare. I don't think the answer can be the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. But I'm asking you, and I'm hoping that in the chat and in the comments and questions at the end of the presentation, perhaps we'll get some feedback on that. And with that, John, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Chief. So I think we're going at a pretty good pace, which I'm glad to see. So I'm going to throw it out for maybe one question now that's coming up so that we can get the question recorded. I didn't see any questions show up in the chat. But is there anybody out there that wants to basically unmute or speak or has a question related to what Chief Valentine just spoke to? So let me ask the question, and to put people on the spot, because those that know me know I don't have much problem with that. So I'll throw it out to Chancellor Elkins for a moment. Oh, look at the proper Southern smile from both Florida and the Carolinas.
We're just trying to get unmuted here.
No worries. So the idea here, Chief, that Chief Valentine spoke to is, and I think you've dealt with it, is what about this idea of how management research might help with the idea of standards of certification for a profession? Chancellors, presidents, everything else, you guys have to deal with certification standards every day, correct?
Correct.
Any thoughts?
I'll tell you, I was just sitting here thinking about everything that the chief has just said about the issues of dealing with getting how much it costs it in every way to get rid of a bad cop and how difficult it is to hire the right ones. And I'm like you, John, I was going back to Tom Timmerman's presentation from earlier in the day about hiring good people and how on earth. I mean, we've all been in this position where thought we were hiring the right people. And then you get in the middle of it and you're not, you know, you've got to figure out a way to make a change. And it is so difficult in
Oh, absolutely.
cities that we all live in.
So to the rest of the
How do
folks
you-
here,
I
sorry,
do
Chief,
have
to cut you
one.
off, but to the rest of the persons here is that Chancellor Elkins is speaking to an earlier presentation where this was already highlighted in basically a plenary session about how much HR and the other kind of stuff in the institution of academia and in management makes an absolute difference. So I'll give a quick allowance for response, but then I want to get on to Paul's piece.
I think Reza had a question, but Chancellor Elkins, I'd be fascinated to know how it is that when you go looking for a candidate at first blush, if someone looks really, really great, how do you figure out that this person may be, if I can use the term, a gypsy professor or a gypsy instructor?
It usually occurs right after tenure.
That's exactly.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Is that
try
for
to
me?
discover
So I
it in
don't
the
have
teacher
tenure.
process.
I would
I
like
don't
to
have
point
tenure, but I have a
something.
1-year probation, and that 1-year probation is like tenure. Reza, I think you had a question, sir.
Mine was more like a comment. As an educator, I want to believe that education helps. And that particular problem that you mentioned in your example, using N word, if people know exactly the meaning of that word, they would stop using it altogether. But some people who are using it don't know actually what the meaning is. So one way to tackle that problem is to educate them, to tell them what is the root and why we should not use it. And I would believe, I'm a strong believer in education. I would believe if people know exactly where it is coming from, they will automatically stop using it.
Good point. Dr. Lewinsky, you had a comment?
Yeah, only addressing an issue of Minneapolis Police Department. I have, because I headed a law enforcement program in the state of Minnesota, we had background checks on our students sometimes. And the 3 times Minneapolis did background checks on their potential hires, we told them one of our students had a steroid problem. They hired him anyway. He ended up in a serious problem, including stuffing minorities into the trunk of his squad car. Later went on to be caught using steroids and bringing them in, went undercover, was promoted further to sergeant at that time. We had another student that we told them he was a drunk. They hired him. And the third person we told he had a cocaine problem and they hired him. So they do background checks, but they hire them for, I don't know why they hire them. They've hired good people from our program, but they've also hired things that their background checks say really don't go. And part of it is the influence of some people, as you saw, like the Federation, head of their police federation, and the influence that comes out of that group. So there's a lot of dynamic factors that go on in the hiring of a person, particularly in an agency that has its problems.
Yeah, so speaking to the commonality of this that we've had up to this point, how many people, I know Chancellor Elkins, I think President Emeritus Bob, as I call him, and the other folks, how many of you guys have already spoke to dealing with governors boards and everything else, that even though you can put it right in front of them, that doesn't mean they're going to choose it? So some of the same stuff that you've dealt with is exactly some of the same stuff we dealt with. So Paul, I'm going to let you jump in now and let's get to your slide, sir.
Great. And as we're waiting for that, I would just ask, is that an individual problem or is that a systems problem? Are we talking about an individual officer? Is it valuable to talk about an individual officer, or should we be looking at this from a systems perspective? Are we, and that's really a great segue into what I'm going to be talking about. My name's Paul. I have about 10 years of practical law enforcement experience, including some time as a patrol sergeant and a use of force instructor and a training manager for a department. I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, where I study human factors and system safety in the context of police interactions with the public. And for this presentation, I'm really interested in sense making after we have a bad outcome. When we see a bad outcome in policing, how do we make sense of that? And with my background and my current responsibilities, one of the things that I get to do on a regular basis is talk to community groups, facilitate discussions between police departments and the community, and help community groups come to terms with, make sense of, and look at police outcomes. And a term that comes up all of the time in almost all of those discussions is the term accountability. I hear it all of the time. And so as we start this discussion, I'd like you to be a little bit self-reflective. What does accountability mean to you? When you think of accountability in the context of policing, what does it mean to you? Now, I'm going to dive into a little bit of a case study, and I find it valuable when I talk about law enforcement topics to shift it a little bit, because a lot of us have strong emotions. We feel strong emotions when we start talking about law enforcement incidents because it's fresh, it's relevant, it's something that we're dealing with on almost, unfortunately, a nightly basis with the news media, and with the discussions that we're having across the country. And so I'm going to shift it a little bit, and we're going to look at World War II bomber pilots. World War II bomber pilots had one of the most dangerous jobs in all of the war. In fact, their casualty rates coming back from bombing missions was horrendous, and there were entire units that were wiped out over the course of the war. It was very dangerous. If we could hold on, I'll go ahead and talk about when we can forward, John. It was very dangerous, and so B-17 bomber pilots and their crews they risked a lot every time they went up. They were high stress missions, but something started to happen, and the Army Air Corps started to take note. As they were coming back from their missions, some bomber pilots were inexplicably, as they were landing, they had survived the mission, they'd made it home, but as they were landing, they were pulling up their landing gear and crashing onto their bellies. You can go ahead and forward it, John. Crashing onto their bellies. And sometimes the planes would be engulfed with flames. Certainly the plane was a complete loss. Sometimes crew members were injured. How do you think the Army Air Corps responded to that? You can go to the next slide. Well, Sidney Dekker tells us that the Western world tends to locate the meaning and cause of suffering in the realm of human moral choice. This is really true in the military, right? I know I'm a prior veteran. You are responsible for yourself. You're responsible for those around you. And particularly as you move up into leadership positions, if you're a captain of a boat or you are the pilot of a plane and there's a crew, you are responsible for that crew. Your choices impact everybody. This typically condenses down to accounts of failure, down to single acts or single actors, right? We tend to look at failure and say, there's the problem right there. We need to get rid of the problem. So what are the organizational responses to this? And you can go to the next slide. Well, the organizational responses from this perspective is, well, we need to write better policies. Our people clearly don't understand what it is they should be doing. Let's write a policy, or better yet, let's make some legislation and put it into place so that we can start to control human behavior. We need to train them better. Clearly, they are not doing the right thing. We need better training. Or there's always the bad apple approach. If we just pull that bad apple out, if we could just not hire that bad apple in the first place, we would never have the issues that we have. And the Army Air Corps took that perspective. They wrote new policies. They said, thou shalt not pull up the landing gear as you're coming in for a landing. They did a safety stand down across the board and told their pilots, listen, when you come in for a landing, do not pull up on the landing gear. And when somebody did, they court-martialed them. They got rid of the bad apples as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. From this perspective, the problem is the pilot. If we just get rid of those pilots, if we could just get the bad pilots out of our organizations, if only our pilots could do what we're asking them to do, what we've trained them to do, we won't have these issues. Does that perspective sound familiar? In the wake of George Floyd, what did we see across the country? We saw police chiefs. We saw even police union directors come forward and say, this was a crime. The problem is out there. If we get rid of that problem, we will have the solution. But there's an issue with that. Next slide, please. The crashes kept happening. In spite of everything that the Army Air Corps tried to do to fix the problem, the pilots, the crashes kept happening. Next slide. So they called in Alfonso Champanis. He is the father of modern human factors and ergonomics to explore this. Now, he interviewed the pilots, but he also looked at the cockpit. And what did Champanis find? He found that the switch right next to, and I'm not a pilot, so I'm going to say this wrong. If there is a pilot in the audience, feel free to correct me. The little switch, the little flappy thing that pulls up the wheels of the plane was right next to the air brakes for the flap, shaped the same way, styled exactly the same way. And he found that the crashes were only happening in a single model of plane. So what did he do? He designed a tactile object to go on the end of the flap nozzle that was shaped like a flap. He designed a tactile a little piece that was shaped like a wheel to go on the landing gear. And how many crashes do you think happened after that because of this reason? Zero. Zero crashes happened. Next slide, please. So my question is, what was causing the plane to crash? Was it the pilot, or was it the complex system in which the social technical system in which the pilot was engaged? Now, here's the thing. We can always recruit better pilots. We can always train them up. But if we put them into the same system that has produced error, that has produced bad outcomes in the past, what are we going to see? We're going to continue to see the same bad outcomes. Next slide, please. We can label this man, we can prosecute him, and maybe we should. Maybe we should. But the question is, does our focus on the individual in this case blind us to the systemic issues that caused the incident in the first place? Does it blind us to the practices within the department? Does it blind us to our hiring practices that got us here? My question is why, not why did this man commit a crime, but why did it make sense for a 14-year veteran in the moment to do what it is that he did? I'm not saying it wasn't a crime. I'm not saying it wasn't wrong. I'm not saying that retribution doesn't need to happen in this case, but we're not learning. We're not moving on to a better place from where we were just by putting him away. Sidney Decker says, we can't learn and blame. You can't do both. You have to take your pick. You can either learn or you can say the problem is over there. That's an important question. Next slide. The concept of accountability is really, really important. We can hold individual officers accountable, but next slide, please. Have we created a place where officers have the ability to give account? Have we created a culture in which officers can come forward and talk about what they've done right, what they've done wrong, and as organizations and as systems, we can learn and improve our practice going forward? I think that's it for the slides. Maybe
it is. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to get almost directly into Dr. Lewinsky's piece, but I want everybody that's here and everybody in the future viewing to think about the potential intersections of things like management theory and systems theory and everything else. This is a social issues track. The oldest society focused on management in the United States by the father of management is already speaking to how they can affect the communities that they live in. These are some of the problems of our day. So I'm going to throw it out as a challenge in that whether it's deans, chancellors, professors, or anything else, is one of the first recognition is just engagement. We'll take a page out of Sarah's entrepreneurship call it the patchwork quilt model, call it whatever you want. It's simply reaching out and starting the conversation. And then it's just, this is the place. It starts with those little ones and ones, and then you reach out. You get a student that says, I want to be able to have impact. And all of a sudden you say, well, have you ever thought of this? And it lines up. So again, I'm just throwing it out there. So Dr. Luisi, sir.
John, can I add one more thing? And
Absolutely.
That's a really important point. And I know that that this organization was founded around or by Taylor, but policing is still stuck in Taylorism. it's still, we've doubled down. Look at the legislation around the country. We've doubled down on what I call panoptic Taylorism. If we just watch them closer, if we can just control their behavior, we'll get better outcomes. We aren't looking at the system, and it really is the profession that science has forgotten. So it's wide open for research, wide open for development.
No, Paul, that's a great point. It's yeah, if we can just manage the assembly line better, right? Dr. Luisi, sir. You're muted, sir.
That is an important first step. Thank you, John.
Yes, sir.
And one of the first things I want to do is thank the association for the organization for the opportunity to speak, and most of all, thank you for the work of putting this together for us. So I really appreciate your effort in all of this. My background is as a professor in a law enforcement program, which had an integrated interdisciplinary approach to law enforcement. At 4 years' time, students graduating from our 4-year law enforcement program got a bachelor's degree and also were eligible for license as a law enforcement officer in the state of Minnesota. We were as close as the university system could get to a clinical program. And I think that's an important component, because when we look at what law enforcement is, whether it's a kind of thing that the university I was connected to, both as program director as well as department chair of the Department of Government, whether it is, well, first of all, we need to look at law enforcement for what it is. We tried to make it, tried to make our educational program a clinical program. And in essence, we failed to do so, primarily because of where we were stationed within the university. But let's go back to what law enforcement is and why I think we needed to do something different as a system that prepared people for the profession, and also how we might have connected better to the profession itself. But I see law enforcement as a clinical profession. In fact, almost everything they do, everything a law enforcement officer does is a process that involves assessment, diagnosis, and some form of prescriptive process. And whether that is assessing someone in the middle of a domestic for the type of persuasive methodology that would be most effective in assisting them to solve the crisis problems they're in, or whether, for instance, they're working with a hitchhiker. And in the state of Minnesota, a hitchhiker at this point in time has about a 50% chance that they are fleeing from a violent or a sexual and violent situation in their home. And any officer that would stop a hitchhiker needs to evaluate whether or not the individual they're dealing with is fleeing from that situation. And if so, what is the kind of persuasive methodology they might use to gain that person's cooperation and really identify a problem that needs solving. And when we look at that, almost all of what law enforcement does is clinical. Unfortunately, by all preparation, whether it's by an academy or by an academic institution, they treat the clinical education and training components as if they were prepping a student for a blue-collar job. And even then, they don't do it very well. If you look at the type of training that law enforcement has. And we have done an extensive amount on that because we think there's something wrong with the system that prepares its people in this fashion. So we have studied it and looked at it. And what we realize is we don't do a very good job of it if it is truly a clinical profession. Next slide, please. And if we look at how the curriculum is established, I have been on 3 state committees looking at curriculum and changes in the curriculum. And we have made some fairly significant progress in this state in our curriculum, but none of it, not a single piece of recommendation anywhere in our post-learning objectives is founded upon an empirical basis. It's based on eminence, not evidence. And it's the eminence of law enforcement experts and not on any evidence-based findings. And even when we look at the length of time that we provide for training, not just the content, what the content is, but if we look at the amount of time we provide for training, it varies. And it varies from somewhere in the realm of just under 500 hours to a little over 1,650 hours for Los Angeles. State of Minnesota, at one point in time at Minnesota State, before I left, we were running approximately 1,650 hours as well for law enforcement training. But if you want to cut a pet's hair at Petco, they will put you into 800 hours of training before they'll even let you close to a pet on your own. And if you want to buff someone's nails in this state, and in most states in this country, it is over 1,600 hours of training to be able to make the decisions about how you're going to work with this person's nails. And if you want to cut hair, it's the same sort of thing. It runs about 1,600 hours in this state. And so it's not just the content, but it's and the type of training. It is the quantity. Because what we're doing, because we have so much to cover in such little time, and it's so expensive for the agency, we do click the box training, meaning we have covered this, we have covered this, we have covered this. The student has provided some form of process that they have completed and achieved some skill or some base with the information. And all that is check the box. There's significant problems with that check the box. And I'll give you an example. And this becomes critical because Chief Wallentine said that after he hires the students, they go to the state academy, they're going to go through an extensive field training program. And 2/3 of the police officers in this state do not go through any sort of formal, in the United States, do not go through any formal FTO field training program, academy training program that is clinical, connected to a department. 2/3 of police officers don't have that clinical application to. So we're running into a serious deficit in the preparation of a clinician if we really do view this as a clinical practice. And I want to point out just another deficiency. We note, for instance, that it is important for officers to have a solid basis of communication. And some departments, in fact, a lot of academies are adding de-escalation to their program. So whether it's de-escalation or whether it's crisis communication or something, they still do a click the box, sort of check the box sort of thing, and they don't get into it very deeply. So we're looking at, does the student, even after graduation, have the skills that they need to be able to, we're not there yet, John, have the skills that they need to be able to function effectively in the world without any more supervision than what they are getting. We don't think they are. For instance, in the application of force, and the Floyd illustration is just one of those illustrations. The laws are tested and the knowledge of laws are tested in a multiple choice exam. But the officer needs to take that information and apply it to dynamic real world situations involving problems that need addressing, and they need to understand the regulation and the rules that they need to operate by. And the clinical practice is never integrated with the legal practice to any extent that it will build a relationship. If we go to communications, it's the same sort of deficiency. The persuasion, which is most cops use persuasion most of the time. And if we look at persuasion, the usual instruction in persuasion in an academy involves telling people that there are 3 methods of persuasion. And I know about this because we've assessed academy training throughout the United States and also throughout Canada and the United Kingdom. And if we look at persuasion, the standard in all 3 countries is to tell officers that there's logical, emotional, and character persuasion. And there's no instruction into how to read people as to which method of persuasion they would be most vulnerable to influence by, which is the actual foundation for the use of the persuasion skill. If you don't have that, you don't know which one will help you be more effective. Now, we did a study, and it's a fairly extensive study. It involved a tremendous commitment by us, $1 million earned dollars, and we hired 2 full-time PhD behavioral analysts, 2 full-time exercise physiologists. We made 10,000 videos in skill acquisition and perishability in 3 major state academies in the United States. And we found significant problems, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But when we looked at the staff training, and we took a lot of videos of the staff, and we found that the academy staff met the requirements for their particular area of expertise. For instance, if they were really good at communication, then they passed a communication course and then an instructional program, and they were allowed to teach. If they were really good at arrest and control techniques, then they took a course that certified them, and they were able to teach in the academy. On the other hand, none of the academy staff really had any understanding of how human beings learned what it is that they were doing. And their ability to provide correction and support and training for variabilities of level of acquisition of the skills was really pretty problematic. Some universities provide training in law enforcement. There are 4 states that have that in the United States at this point, where you can go to a 2-year or 4-year university. And we find problems within that. In our assessments of university-based training, almost all the training is within colleges of social and behavioral science or something equivalent to that aspect. And they do not understand the role of clinical training. We've looked at models of training provided by, for instance, nursing, or even accounting to get into the area of expertise of individuals within this program, or biology, or chemistry, where people would actually bring knowledge and clinical skills, practical skills in an integrated fashion. And it would certainly be really different if we had law enforcement in some other foundation than a criminal justice program. We also found that those who shape and deliver the curriculum do not have the structure, the resources, and knowledge or insight to provide adequate skill training. So there's a significant problem with the system from the very beginning. We'll give you the results of our 10,000 videos on skill acquisition. Recruits who had graduated, and this is across all of the academies we studied, maintained a relative correct process of the whole skill. John, yeah, hit it please. For the skill when it's done solely, yet the critical step for the simple skill was at 29%, meaning that despite what we taught and how many hours we put people in an academy, when they were graduating from the academy, their skill level was at a minimum of 29%, meaning that it was no longer applicable in an applied clinical situation. It is a darn good thing we hire good people, because we're not preparing them very well for the type of job we are putting them into. Okay. So there's, we think from our perspective, looking at training in the police world, we think there's a need for task analysis in the police world. Now, there's been a number of task analysis studies that have been done on law enforcement, but they've all dealt with the type of activity that cops do, and nothing has been done on the decision-making process, and particularly connected to the type of incident that officers need to make decisions in, nor the training that's necessary to facilitate really good decision-making and skill acquisition within that. Next, please. So we think that, first of all, to have really good decision-making, and I was just looking at a study that's just come out today, to look at really good decision-making, you really need to have great knowledge about the area in which you're making that decision, and what works functionally within that situation. Otherwise, the emotional response of the officer within that situation is such that they really make bad decisions because they don't have the skill, don't have the competence, and really don't know how to make effective decisions within those areas. So whether it's on the academies we're looking at, or whether it's on the state level, we need way more research into what makes effective decision-making in law enforcement, particularly how to deliver that type of training so that officers have what we as a society expects them to have.
Okay, guys, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I know other people can look at it later, so that if we can continue the conversation for those that are still here or that kind of stuff, I want you guys to get involved in the conversation. So I'm going to speak briefly about framing, and I'm just going to give you an example of stuff that has sort of been hit upon a little bit throughout the conference up to this point. So I want you to imagine this for a minute. This is out of the Washington Post database, which, if anything, would be over-reporting on some of the stuff on their pieces. And I want you to just think about this in this context. 1 out of every 67,000 contacts, a citizen with a police officer, and I want you to think about this as scientists and evidence-type people. You guys do management research, you publish, right? Which equates to 0.0015% of all face-to-face contacts result in a death involving police use of force against the citizen. Now, I want you to put this in a perspective. I want you to imagine that someone told you what you're going to have to do right now is I'm going to give you 67,000 video clips. They're all going to be 5 seconds apiece. And your job, because actually you guys will assign it to your graduate students, but their job will be to basically watch these clips continuously, no breaks, 5-second clip after 5-second clip. It will take you 11.5 8-hour days to view those clips. Now, somewhere in those clips is one 5-second snippet of a lethal force with a police officer, and it isn't that it's judged right, wrong, or anything else. Get judgment out of the way. It's just a picture of information processing. Out of 67,000 clips, 5 seconds at 11.5 8-hour days. Do you think you would still have the same perspective? Do you think your students will still have the same perspective? We know this with normalization of data sets, but this is some of the stuff we were talking about today, about myopic algorithms, how stuff brings back what you're looking for. You can only seek what you find. How do you deal, back to Sarah's talk today, how do you deal with the unknown unknowns? These are basic concepts found in complexity decision-making, and I would argue has to be adopted within management, and management could assist with law enforcement. We will change the frame of our perspective, and we already know there's social media. I attended one thing this morning with social media research about how is it that AI and social media is affecting the way we think, and it's in the School of Management and Business, as well it should be. Okay, this is a excerpt from a peer-reviewed paper by an economist of color, Ronald Fryer, who won economic medals. And one of the things that when they went through is he did it from a perception of a scientist. He did an amazing study, really did. Short answer was, he found out that when it comes to lethal force, there was no statistically significance in the results, but with non-lethal force, there absolutely was. And again, I'm not arguing for or against. I'm an expert witness for both plaintiffs and defendants in federal court, with the goal being to increase understanding and to help, to Paul's point, is how the hell did we get here? A systemic problem requires systems thinking, okay? Racial disparity, a recent study, 2016, the context deadly force situations, 2-year fatal shooting data, 16 crime rate estimates, but when they adjusted, we find no systemic evidence. What's co-opting our frame? Studies from just across the board from 2012, and these are use of force in different ratios as related to arrest. All of these are shaping our beliefs, but where's the research about how to think about these things in a smart way? Now, this is interesting, at least I thought it was. Of those who experience a threat or use of force, 84% consider it to be excessive. I don't like being threatened with force. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the equate for that. And again, I'm not arguing for or against. What I'm arguing for is true scientists looking at it from an academic standpoint to get to a better understanding. I believe that we can learn from management, that law enforcement can learn from management theory and decision science. We can understand that fixes have unintended consequences that basically then set up our next problem. We can understand from decision quality, a hallmark for decision science is found in management. We can use systems mapping and causal design loops just to tell stories, how confirmation bias and everything else works from the so-called fake news cycle. There's already research out there. It's already working. And management has this. To prove the point, systems modeling to examine law enforcement, collaboration, response to crime, Brocklesby, peer review, 2016. Let's see, systems modeling, improved capacity, rapidly escalating complexity, complexity management perspective, organizational problems have to be carefully managed. So throwing this out as a discussion point to the management schools, to the deans, to the chairs, to the professors, I absolutely believe that your students can have effect on the societal issues that maybe drive passion or motivation with them. So that being said, we are right on the money. So let's have a conversation. And Reza, just so you know, if you don't, I can help you jump in. So Reza, thoughts?
It was very thought-provoking, session. Thank you, all presenter, for doing that. Like any other industry, when industry have problem, they come to academia and say, this is the problem. How can we solve the problem? The question is, has there been similar move from law enforcement, community to reaching out to academia and say, this is our problem, let's solve it together? Because you can say why academia is not coming to us and solving our problem. The question is, the movement is relative. We can come to you or you can come to us.
Yeah, no, I'm going to let Paul and then Dr. Luisi and Ken speak to that. But just so you know, I would argue the opposite. I would argue, like you just saw that last comment, academia is looking at that. I have no problems with that. I'm asking for even more help. So the thing is, I think that they are. And I think what happens is you just don't see it. And give examples from Dr. Lewinsky's, a clinical professional. We can learn a lot, for example, from medical. We can learn a lot from management when it comes to decision making. So Paul, you had a comment.
I just like to say, policing is one of the few professions I know of where the academic track and the practitioner track of so the criminal justice side in academia and policing as a practice are almost on two separate tracks, or have been for a long period of time. I think that the crisis that we've seen recently has recently throughout the country, the pushback from the public has opened the door. And I think I have seen law enforcement seeking out academic help. I think one of the issues is that we don't have practitioners in law enforcement in the same numbers that we do, say, in business, in entrepreneurship, in nursing, in law, moving up into the academic ranks, so that there is perspective to the research, so that our researchers are asking the right questions. And I think that's a very real issue that we need to bridge.
John, before you go to the next panelist, I want to mention that what I meant is, criminal justice is one area in academia, but as you have mentioned, John, yourself, economists have worked on this.
Yeah.
Decision scientists have worked on this, psychologists have worked on this, and then people in management have worked on this.
Yep.
So, it is a multidisciplinary issue, and there is a multidisciplinary approach to it. So we have to actually keep our mind open. And I can tell you I, as a person who has a little bit of interest in analytics, I would love to have some data that I can work with and try to solve different problems using that data analysis. I mean, if I'm approaching somebody from, let's say, Clayton County, the county that is around our university, if somebody comes and say, I have this data, make some sense out of it and see what is the proportion of, let's say, violent versus non-violent crimes and all of those things, and then what are the determinants of each of those. I would love to play with that data set. So what I'm saying is that this coming together should come from both sides. And I think there is a willingness on business schools, definitely, now that ASCSP accreditation is depending on societal impact, and it is much valued. We would love to have some real problems, real world problem, and play with it and try to solve it.
All good
The
points.
opportunity is there.
No, absolutely good points. Spot on. Mayor.
Okay, so I have one comment and one question where I always have problem with my students explaining something, the difference between the symptoms and the problem itself. Because sometimes we say symptoms, that there are weeds in the backyard. That's a symptom, it's not a problem. The sales are going down. That's not a problem. That's a symptom. There can be multiple symptoms with the cause. And that is something that Paul Taylor was talking about. So when he identified that policeman, so we have to really teach our students to analyze the problem. And that's where I will agree with Dr. Reza, that we have to have enough data where we can identify the problem. Because the problem starts with identification of the problem. That is the cause of the whole situation, that we have not really identified the problem, we have identified the symptom, and you spend so much time solving the symptom, you pull out the weeds, and the weeds are back after 2 weeks again. Agreed. So then in the case of that airplane case that you're talking about, the fighter plane, I think the problem was in the design. When they did the design thing, how come they did not invite this human guy from wherever he came from while they were designing? Because this is something I learned at Texas Instruments, that electrical engineers were there, but we always used to have somebody from human factor side, and he was looking, and he's not looking for your design, but how the components are placed. So, and that could have solved a lot of problems. So I think it's the identification of the problems should be emphasized more.
I agree. And walking this over to Dr. Lewinsky as well, one of the things you're highlighting, and Paul has already highlighted, is the concept of system, right? We recognize that, and this is why one of the framing questions is, as we progress in a global society, as in a connected society, and we are more interconnected, we by the very nature are part of systems management, of systems interconnection. So the idea is, what is the system? Back to Denali Meadows, the purpose of a system is just look at what it puts out. Whether you designed it for something else, that's the reality of it. So it is what it is. So fix the system, don't fix the symptom. So systems thinking and that type of stuff, I think, is absolutely critical. And one of the things that I see in management is management recognizes that it lives in the context of a greater system. If you want to get profit and we're doing this, you want to get an ounce, you're always in the context of a greater system that has multiple variables. Dr. Lewinsky, you had something, sir.
Right, as was pointed out, and I'll frame it a little differently. Society has a real problem differentiating correlation from causality.
Yeah.
And that's one of the first things I learned in my experimental psychology course was you've got to understand the difference. And just because an officer is connected proximity temporally to an incident doesn't mean there's causal factors there, and everybody confuses that. If we look at the Floyd death, for instance, and there's no question the officer did not shift from restraint to resuscitation, and he should have, and he should pay the price for that. But Floyd had 3 times the level of fentanyl in his system that would cause him to die. And if he'd been at home on his couch, he would be dead and we would not have this problem. But there was police interaction and it was videotaped. And now we run into a serious problem, and it's a serious problem in academia. And we attempted as a law enforcement program to integrate in our own university, and I understand it's not symptomatic across nationally, but I see enough of it nationally, it really concerns me. When we went to our sociology program and we went to our nursing program and we went to a variety of other programs, and we were looking at what can you contribute to our program? How can we really treat law enforcement as an interdisciplinary, integrated clinical program, which is what it is. So many skills, so many problems, all types of problems. And the sociologists were the clearest. They said, we don't want any boot-jacketed Gestapos marching on our campus. It's like, we're not going to deal with force. Force is dirty. We know what the solution is. We'll teach cops to be anti-bias. We'll teach them to be whatever. We'll teach them, but we're gonna not talk to them about force, and we're not gonna talk to them about. It was really discouraging because A, they didn't understand the nature of the problem. B, they weren't willing to research it as really objective scientists to really try to come to an understanding of what it is that was going on and why we were getting the results. And they were really unwilling to dive into the clinical components that are really necessary in this world. I mean, if you look at the integration of everything, we need communication people who really know how communication connects to someone who's holding a gun and is threatening to kill himself or somebody else. And that's a rare type of communication, and it goes way beyond the communication programs that are taught in most universities. So we're really looking for some kind of very sophisticated skill. But before we even get into that, we need people who are willing to take an objective view of what is happening and get the data and really pay close attention to the data and to approach that with an unbiased, non-systematic, non-system approach to the problem they're trying to find out about. People come in with an answer already because of what they think they know. And that turns the profession off from the academic community in a very serious way.
Right. So echoing everything and the bias research that's being done, especially in the management world, about how it influences decision-making, again, is another piece of that. Before we close out, I want to make sure that Glenn, Chris, or Nancy, if you have anything that you want to bring up, add, please feel free to unmic or unmute or whatever you want to do and bring up your concepts.
I'm also eager for Chief Wallenstein's response as
Yes,
well.
I'll make sure we got time for all you guys to do.
I mean, I'd like to respond a little bit. I mean, as someone who's gone through an undergrad program with a major in psychology and a minor in sociology, I want to say I think that the approach that you received, Mr. Lewinsky, was so counter to what I learned as the foundational principles of psychology and sociology. It really brings to light that law enforcement sits in this really tough position where, you know, we have all of these preconceived notions and all of these biases that not only are they there, but they're so public and they're so constantly in our faces that, you know, it's not like coming in as a business consultant and showing up at Amazon and saying, hey, you have employees peeing in bottles, like maybe we should fix this. You know, this is, you know, very emotionally charged material. And, you know, I definitely resonate with this, the idea of the systems thinking, that we need to look at not only the implications of how we're teaching what we're teaching, but you know, the structure behind it, and you know what it is that is required for the job. And I think, you know, I definitely agree with what you've presented. I think there's this real disconnect between what it is that the job mandates, you know, what these officers are required to do, and what it is that we're teaching them to do and how we're teaching them to do that.
So Chris, thank you for that. And Reza, are we okay for about 2 minutes?
Yes, I
Okay,
mean,
we'll do that.
the
So
next
keep
session
on
starts
time.
exactly at
Keep
5.
on
But
time. I'll give you the close and then I'll just end with contact information.
I just want to come back to your question because I think it's so important. I, as a chief of over 15 years and a cop of over 40 years, I can count really just on one hand the people that I really know well and can call up and speak to in academia. And frankly, 2 of them are on this line with me, and Bill, one of my long-term friends, is one of them. There is a disconnect, and it's because we haven't built these relationships, and that's why I'm doing this today. These things make me nervous as all get out. I'm not like these other folks. It's the same reason I sat in a room on Thursday afternoon with a bunch of people in the community of color in my town who I wanted to break out of that like me bias that I suffer from. And so these kind of encounters help us break beyond the lack of relationships in academia, in print, social media, on TV. The academics who study race, culture, and criminal justice, they're the ones that are sharing their interpretation of recent events, not the folks from the School of Medicine, not the people from the School of Management. And we've got to make these connections. I recently tried to read, I read a paper published by Craig Patterson, who's a lecturer in criminology at Sheffield Hallam University in Great Britain, on higher education, police training, and police reform, marrying those 3 together. And it was significant to me that if I want to get that kind of information, I need to go to Great Britain, where for years academia has been knit together with public safety. That's the landslide. That's the major cultural shift we've got to make.
So again,
thank you, John.
Yes, absolutely, Chief. So great conversation. I want to get it recorded. The slide deck is there. I'll leave you with a final quote. In place of finding the right answer, we seek to gain a shared understanding of possible solutions. This came out of basically wicked problem theory with Christensen, but notice a date on it. It's 2009. I really want to thank Chancellor Elkins, Professor Desai, Chair Karen Dish, Dean Abbey, all of you guys that have taken a chance to take a look at this and listen. The one thing that I told everybody else here as a speaker is I've never met a more supportive organization that isn't about proving who they are and who isn't part of them, but instead is more about including it. So I thank you for that very much so. That being said, and for you guys that don't know, if I should address not only that as President-elect Elkins of the Society. So my apologies. All references are here, and with that, we can go out.